on with the actual invitational skills. And so you can see that there's a chart where they branch off. And so all of these are considered opening or invitational skills because they open up the session, they open up the relationship, they invite the client in to talk. And so within the opening skills, you have encouragers and you have questions. Now, it's going to get a little bit confusing because door openers are basically questions as well, but they're questions that fit a very particular purpose, and in general, you're only going to use door openers very early in the session. Or if a client brings something up that you're not sure if they want to talk about or tell you more about, you can use a door opener in that circumstance. So we'll talk about what the difference is between closed and open questions, minimal encouragers. And when you're labeling these in your videos, I really care the most that you're appropriately labeling closed and open questions, as well as minimal encouragers, depending on how many you're using. But the door openers, if you end up labeling that as a question, I think that's very appropriate because they basically are questions. So the encouragers, we'll start with those first. And so the encouragers are basically just encouraging the client to talk about things. And so they're intended to be a non-coercive invitation to talk. So the door openers, I see you look down today. Do you want to talk about it? On the phone, you told me you're having some trouble at work. Can you tell me more about that? So if you know why a client's coming in, or if a client calls you between sessions, you can refer back to what they talked about and ask if they want to tell you more about it. And then the beginning of a lot of counseling sessions, if you don't have a specific agenda, what would you like to talk about today? So it's just sort of opening things up without any particular agenda or expectation that they answer the question. So again, door openers are probably the rarest of any of these skills. Minimal encouragers depends on what's going on with both you as a counselor and the client. So these are, I see, yes, right, okay, tends to be a very common one. I think you have to get a little bit careful with right, because that can come off as an endorsement of what the client is saying. So you just need to be mindful of the minimal encouragers that you're using. If you have a really verbal client, you're probably going to use more minimal encouragers because you still want to maintain a presence in the counseling session and demonstrate that you're listening, but you often don't have space to make a direct response, so you'll make the minimal encouragers. People have different amounts that they use minimal encouragers. I think if you just want to strike some balance. So if you are doing almost none, and you have a very verbal client, it can come off that you're not actually listening. If you're doing a lot, it can really intrude on the counseling session and be somewhat distracting. So you'll become more aware of this as you watch yourself or as people watch you. Questions. Really, with beginning counselors, it is strongly encouraged that you try to avoid questions. Questions are very challenging to provide in an appropriate way. So I really encourage people to try to avoid questions and try to use the reflective responses. So obviously when you're beginning a counseling session, you don't have any information to reflect on, so you have to ask some questions. So, it's your opportunity to practice them, but often, especially beginning counselors, can become over-reliant on questions. It can lead to a problematic dynamic within the counseling relationship. So there's an interesting paradox that happens where the more questions you ask, often the less information the client voluntarily provides, because they become so reliant on you asking questions, they wait for you to ask rather than bringing things up that are important to them. So you have to be really mindful about what kind of dynamic you're using. The other issue is, as we will get into the reflective responses, it's much easier to provide a good reflective response than it is to provide a good question. So the problem with questions is the more that you ask, the more likely you are to ask a bad question, which you're going to get around to all these examples of bad questions. So in order to avoid bad questions, the first thing you can do is just ask as few as possible. Also, you want to avoid interrogation. So this is the relationship dynamic that can emerge, where it turns into, I ask a question, the client answers. I ask a question, the client answers. I ask a question, the client answers. And that becomes the dynamic you create. Or I ask 15 questions, and the client is under an immense amount of pressure. because also when you're asking a question that's not in a door opener kind of way, it can put a lot of pressure on the client that you're expecting an answer or you're expecting a particular type of answer. So just be really mindful of the type of performance anxiety that's put on clients. So reflective responses and door openers really give more room to the client to reflect and make decisions about what kind of response they're going to provide you. There's less pressure in a reflective response, which we'll learn later because the questions open up, and then as you start to get information, you start to use reflective response. And as we get into the reflective responses, I'll show you how you balance them and alternate between the two. So the first type of bad question you can ask is to ask why. As counselors, we don't ask why. Inside of our own heads, we're trying to figure out why, but you want to avoid directly asking the client why, and there's a few reasons for this. Number one, they don't know. If they knew, they wouldn't be in counseling with you. So sometimes you'll ask why, and the client is thinking in their head, I don't know, that's why I'm here. It can come across as judgmental. So there are some questions that you can phrase in a different way than why, and really get into the information that you want without that tone of judgment that can come along with why questions. So, why did you decide to do that? Can come off extremely judgmental and kind of shaming, versus what contributed to that decision. Because what you're really looking for is what are the cognitions, what are the background, what are the situational factors that led to you making that decision, instead of, why. Why has a certain type of meaning in our society and culture. And then finally, asking why, for the reasons above, is just not very effective. Typically, even if the clients say they have an explanation for why they're doing what they're doing, if they're in counseling and they have blind spots, their explanation is probably not completely holistic and taking into account all the factors that they really need to be helpful to them. So the other two types of bad questions, one is leading question. And so there are some examples on page 76. Leading questions tend to be hidden interpretation or advice. Or, I'll talk about when we get to reflective statements a bit more. You have information to make a reflective statement, you know what you see, and you ask the client instead of just telling them. But it's often, I figured out something really smart, I want you to come to the same conclusion that I do, and you just have to be careful because with leading questions, you're really pushing that person to agree with you, and if you make it as a reflective statement, then it puts it out there, and the client is not under as much pressure to take it in. So types of leading questions, do you think you did that because you wanted your boyfriend to end the relationship? You have decided that that's why they did that thing, but you're asking them to agree with you instead of just saying what you're seeing. Have you always had problems with your boss? Particularly in the context where the client hasn't said that they've had problems with their boss, it's more appropriate to ask kind of an open question. What is your relationship like with your boss? Tell me about your relationship with your boss. Do you allow other people to influence your decision making? So again, you've maybe figured something out where you think this client is very susceptible to other people, and then you're asking them a leading question that's going to lead them to be influenced in their decision making. So really try to avoid leading questions. The other type of questions are, double-ended questions, and these can actually turn into more than two questions. You are allowed to ask one question at a time. You have to ask one question and then wait for the client's answer. If their answer leads to the next question you wanted to ask, you can ask that question. Or if they fully answer the question you ask, you can then potentially ask another question. But if you ask them 15 questions in one breath, they're probably going to respond to the last question that you asked them, but they also might just get confused. So double-ended, how have things been in your life this week? Have you enacted maybe the changes we discussed last week? So you're asking them how things are, and then you're asking them if they've done the things you talked about. And so they'll probably respond to the last one, but that's also somewhat leading because you don't necessarily know that things have been going better for them, but you're building that in anticipation that things will be better. So be mindful, what's your purpose of doing that? How many times a week does this occur? Have you tried anything to reduce it? So with both of those questions, you're basically leading them in two opposite directions. You want to know more about how often something's happening, but then you're also wanting to know if they're reducing it. And so they're probably going to answer the second question, but it's also going to lead to some confusion about what is your direction and where are you going. So and when you're allowed to ask them. So there's closed questions, and you really want to be careful and mindful of when you're asking closed questions and why you're asking closed questions, because closed questions ask for specific information. So it can be factual information, and typically they can be answered as a yes or a no. The problem with closed questions is they close off the conversation. You know, how old are you? 22. What's your major? Physics. When did you start school? Last week. If you start asking a lot of closed questions in a row, it can turn into this vicious cycle of, I'm asking you a question, it gives me a one-word answer. I'm asking a question, it gives a one-word answer, which doesn't open up the counseling relationship. Sometimes you need to know things. So you need to know, how long you've been working there, so you can get a sense of how long they've been having problems at work, or how long they've been having problems with their boss, or how much experience they have in a field. But you really want to be thoughtful about when you're using them. Because it can, and I would also say that when people get anxious and they're not sure how to respond, this is what they revert to. And it really creates, it then exacerbates the problem where you feel like the conversation isn't going anywhere, so you ask more close questions. So what tends to happen is there's either one or two thoughtfully chosen closed questions, or there's this endless cycle of 35 closed questions, and then later when you look back at it, you realize what happened. So just be mindful of that. So, how old are you? Would you describe your marriage as happy? What kind of question is that? What would be a better way to get at that information? So that is a closed question because it looks for a yes or no, but it's also a bad question. And so I'll leave that to you to figure out what type of bad question it is. So the other type of acceptable questions are open questions, and these are really the winner of the question category. If you're going to ask a question, particularly a counseling and therapy-based question, it's really helpful if they're open questions. They open up the conversation, they open up exploration and awareness, and they open up the opportunity for the client to talk, because it's more than a one-word answer. It's typically more than just brief factual information. So it allows the client to decide how long of an answer they want to give. It leads into deeper understanding, and it's much less likely to be coercive. So when you're asking an open question, it's not leading the client somewhere. It's allowing them to decide where they're going to want to go, which is our goal in the relationship with them. So, can you tell me what kind of problems you've been having? And you say go to self-esteem problems, what do you mean by that? A great question very frequently in counseling is to have a client provide more specificity or to define what things mean to them. Because we cannot assume that what self-esteem problems look like for the client is what self-esteem problems look like for us. Or even what self-esteem problems look like for client A or what self-esteem problems look like for client B. That is a great opportunity to get more information, and sometimes too to get the client to think, man, I've been using this term all this time, self-esteem. What does that actually mean to me? What am I meaning when I say that I have self-esteem problems? So open-ended questions can really start to open up the conversation, and they can really start to open up the client thinking about things. You really want to get them thinking about things because you can know everything about what's going on with them. But until they know it, and really until they discover it for themselves, it's not real and it doesn't lead to change. And so that is the end of the introduction to invitational skills.